2:03, so I'm going to go. I'll start that again. Good afternoon, everybody. It's 2:03, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. I did just upload a PDF copy of this presentation into the webinar chat box so that you can download it if you want. The PDF version will give you a copy with all the links that live so that if you want to look things up afterwards, it should make it easy for you. I've also provided this and she can facilitate also sending it out after if that's okay. If you have questions as we go along, we're in webinar mode. So you can either use the webinar chat to ask a question, which is probably easier, or you can also use the question and answer. It's open because we are in webinar mode, but I would encourage you to use the chat. Sarah Govro from Contact North is in the background and she's going to help me out with monitoring the chat. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'll introduce myself today. My name's Robin Ritchie, and I might know some of you. There might be some new people here. I've worked in the literacy field for about 25 years. And I have a few different roles right now. I'm the executive director of Lauback Literacy Ontario, which is a provincial support organization. And I also manage a school board literacy and basic skills program. And at the school board, I also manage the adult ESL program, which includes ESL funding and federal funding, and we're an assessment center. So based on my experience, Marissa asked me if I would come and do a webinar with you today about supporting English as a second language learners in literacy and basic skills. So this webinar that I'm going to do today is kind of just an introductory webinar to this topic. I'm going to touch on a lot of things, and I'm going to try to share a fair amount of resources with everybody today that will hopefully help you get started or support what you might already be doing in terms of supporting ESL learners in your LBS programs right now. In the upcoming fiscal year, we're going to be doing another webinar, so it will be kind of a follow-up to this, which will be a little more in depth and a bit of a review again of what we've talked about today. So you can look for that in the future. Okay, so I'm going to just move on and give you a little bit of an overview of the topics I'm going to touch on today. So again, this is going to be kind of an introduction or an overview to this topic in general. So we're going to jump around a little bit because I want to try to give you a lot of information and a lot of places where you can go and find other information. Today, I'm going to talk about who can participate. And by who can participate, I mean who can participate in a literacy and basic skills program. I'm going to talk a little bit about the difference between LINC, which is one type of funding, and ESL, which is another type of funding. And I'm going to do that because I think it's important for people to have a broad understanding of how all these different programs are being funded right now and how LBS can support. I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of the Canadian language benchmarks, and I think that's also important information for you to have or be familiar with if you're working with adult English as a second language students. We're going to talk a little bit about unique characteristics and needs that ESL students might have. We're going to touch on instruction tips. Instruction tips is something that we could do an entire webinar on, and something that we might expand upon a little bit more in the next fiscal year. I'm going to talk a little bit about a trauma-informed approach. This is not trauma-informed training by any stretch, but I am going to just touch on that topic because it's also something that you should be mindful of when you're working with English as a second language learners. I'm going to talk a little bit about milestones. Everybody should be familiar with milestones. And then really the last probably third of the webinar is really going to be about resources. So what resources are out there and how you can access those resources. And at the end, I'll leave a little bit of space for questions again. But as I said, as we go through, feel free to post questions that you have in the chat. I have the box open, so I'll try to keep my eye on it, and I will try to answer questions as we go along, as long as time permits me to do that. You have to excuse me, my throat's a little dry today, so I'm going to take a sip of my tea every once in a while as we go along. So first of all, when we're working with English as a second language learners, it's important to know who can participate in a literacy and basic skills program. What happened recently is that the LBS service provider guidelines were updated. They were updated actually just in December of 2023. Prior to 2023, it was recommended that English language learners would be at least a Canadian language benchmark level 6 in speaking and listening to be really able to participate in a literacy and basic skills program. The CLB 6 suggestion was actually removed from the service provider guidelines in December of 2023. It was removed for a few reasons. First, it was a bit misleading, and a lot of people believed that because it said that they couldn't serve English as a second language learners unless they were at a CLB level 6 in speaking and listening. That wasn't actually the way it was worded. It was a recommendation, not a requirement. However, it was interpreted differently across the province. So removing that was one way to make sure that there wasn't a hard interpretation on that level. The other thing that I guess is important to note is that there's a lot of ESL learners trying to access LBS services right now for a number of different reasons. And we'll talk a little bit about those reasons as we go through the webinar. Being at a CLB 6 and speaking and listening shouldn't necessarily preclude somebody from participating in LBS. And the new guideline really talks about what it should be, which is that they should be sufficiently proficient in speaking and listening to be able to benefit from the LBS program. So it's a lot softer now, and it gives programs a lot more leeway to actually work with English as a second language learners. I just thought this was an interesting fact, and I put it in here just so that people could kind of see where that CLB 6 was a little stringent in terms of whether or not people could work in an LBS program, because in order to have proof for Canadian citizenship, you actually only have to proof that you can speak and listen at a Canadian benchmark level 4 or CLB level 4 in either French or English. That's part of the application process if you're applying to become a Canadian citizen. So that's interesting because it means that the federal government feels that if you're at a CLB 4 in speaking and listening, then you're at a high enough level that you can actually apply for Canadian citizenship. So in terms of potential client groups, this is where I think this topic has become a very hot topic. There are a lot of English language learners or potential English language learners, especially right now in our province, because we've had some huge immigration waves. And it's putting a lot of stress on the current language training system, and because it's not adequately funded in order to be able to support all of these people, and there aren't programs available everywhere. So I see kind of 4 potential client groups that have emerged, or in some cases they existed even prior to this these waves of immigration. But the groups are primarily, or what I see as the groups are: group 1, clients that have been assessed for language training. but they're on a wait list. So that's very common across the province right now. There are tons and tons of people who have gone through the formal assessment process, which you have to do to access language training, but they cannot access service because there isn't service available right now. Group number 2 are clients that are unable to access language training for reasons such as lack of childcare, family responsibilities, or they're employed and they can't actually attend language training that exists in whatever community they live in, because most language training programs are full-time programs. Group 3 are clients that have no access to language training service. So there just aren't programs in the communities that they live in. And then the group 4 is the clients that have finished language training. So they've completed whatever is available in their community, but they need further upgrading. And in some cases, that transition can be to LBS as well, or should be to LBS if that's the programming that's available. So I would just, before we kind of get into this any further, I assume, I shouldn't really assume, but I would think that a lot of you are here because this is an issue in your communities. So I'm going to ask you to put up your hand if you are seeing clients in your community or trying to access your program that are from group 1. So that is clients that have been assessed for language training, but they're on a wait list right now. Is there anybody in the audience that has seen clients like that trying to access their programs? And if so, put up your hand.
Hi, Robin. I don't think they can put their hands up.
Okay, I thought they could because it looks like they can.
Yeah.
Okay, no problem. Forget it. We will abandon this. I
Yeah,
thought
but
they might be able
they
to.
can put it in the chat. They could put yes or something like
Okay,
that.
in chat, sure. So is there any that thank you very much. So is there anybody in that is seeing any clients from group 1? Just put yes in the chat box. I haven't seen anybody do it yet, but I'll give you a second. Okay. Still, okay, how about group 2? Is anybody seeing clients trying to access? Oh, I did see one person. Okay, what about group 2? Clients that are, okay, yes to group 2. Clients that are unable to access training because of work, childcare, family responsibilities. How about group 3? Is anybody from a community where there are potential or current ESL clients and there just isn't any language training services in that community? Group 3? Okay. Yeah, okay. That's a very common problem right now. I know a lot of the northern communities don't have language training programs running. Only online available, also a big problem. And online is not particularly the best type of training, especially for the lower level learners. Okay, what about okay, online begins only for level 3, CLB2, nothing below that there. Yeah. So what about clients? Does anybody see clients that have finished language training and try to access LBS after they're done language training for further upgrading? Okay, so we have some from group 4 too. Okay, thanks. I just wanted to make sure everybody was awake. I apologize for the hand thing. I thought you could do that. I'm not used to using webinar. I always use just regular Zoom meetings, so I forget what happens in each of them. So primarily, we're going to talk today about probably more group 1, 2, and 3. Group 4 is a little different. Usually if people have access language training and they've reached a certain CLB level, the transition is a little easier for them. They've already been in some type of formal training. and they probably have higher level skills to be able to access LBS. So really, we're going to probably talk the most of what we talk about today is going to apply to those first three groups. I did see a question in the, okay, just wanted to check the Q&A. So I guess it's really important. This topic's become very important because there are so many people out there that really need to be able to access some service, and they're very limited on what they can access. And it benefits everybody if they're able to access LBS programs, especially the community, like the learners themselves, who might not otherwise be able to access any programming, and the communities that they're living in. I'm going to just talk a little bit quickly about the difference between LINC and ESL. And the reason I'm going to do that is because I think it's important, if you don't work in a agency that actually has these different types of funding streams, it's kind of important to have a sense of how they work, because it can affect what happens within a community in terms of what's available. So both of these programs are based on the Canadian language benchmarks. LINC programs are funded by the federal government, and ESL classes are funded by the provincial government. ESL is actually called Adult Non-Credit Language Training Program, but is more commonly referred to as ESL. So the main difference between these two funding streams is that a naturalized Canadian citizen is eligible for provincial training, but they're not eligible for federal training. So that's somebody who is not a Canadian at birth, but has acquired citizenship under the provisions of the Canadian law through that citizenship application process. So why does this matter? It matters because even if there is a program in your region, or a program starts up in your region, there still might be gaps in who they can serve depending on the type of funding that they have. A lot of programs that offer ESL or have ESL contracts have both types of funding. And they offer it quite seamlessly, and people would never know what funding they're accessing. But that's not true everywhere, and in a lot of places, they either have one or the other. Only school boards have ESL funding. That's another important distinction. Right now, only school boards can access that provincial funding stream, whereas anybody pretty much can access the LINC funding. So profits, school boards can also access that, but a wider range of agencies can access LINC funding to deliver English, basically English as a second language. So the terms are always used interchangeably, but the funding streams are different. I'm not going to read through exactly what each fund. You will have a copy of the presentation, but this just gives you a sense of the differences. Without getting getting into like the minutia of it, it just gives you a sense of how they differentiate in the funding. But the main difference really is that difference of whether or not somebody is a Canadian citizen. If they're a Canadian citizen, the federal program will not fund their training, but the provincial program still will. ESL, the provincial program, another interesting thing about it is that it used to have its own ministry not that many years ago. It was then moved to the Ministry of Community and Social Services, and most recently has been moved into the Ministry of Labor, Immigration, Training, and Skills Development. So that program has been moved into the same ministry that also funds our program, Literacy and Basic Skills. Another thing that I think is good to know in terms of background is that the Canadian language benchmarks and the Ontario Adult Literacy Curriculum Framework have a lot in common. Both of them are competency-based, and both are very client-centric or learner-centered. So they both focus on activities that are relevant and meaningful to the learner and help a learner achieve their goals. They both focus on task-based or contextualized learning. So the learning is always linked to real-life tasks, things that somebody's going to do when they leave the program. And they both support learning relevant to both to work, to the community, and to further education and training. Is this a coincidence that they're so close? Not really, because the CLBs, the Canadian Language Benchmarks, were in existence prior to the Ontario Adult Literacy Curriculum Framework development. And the CLBs was one of many frameworks that were reviewed and considered during the development of the Ontario Adult Literacy Curriculum Framework. So you do see a lot of the same guiding principles underlying both of those framework pieces, which makes it really a nice fit to be able to work with English language learners in literacy and basic skills. The Canadian Language Benchmarks is a system that's used across Canada, and it's used to measure and describe the proficiency of adult English as a second language learners. So the CLB framework is divided into 12 benchmark levels. Each represents a different stage of learning proficiency. So it's actually 12 levels across 3 stages. The benchmarks themselves cover 4 language skills. So they cover listening, speaking, reading, writing. That is the focus of language training. So we go beyond that in literacy and basic skills because we also do numeracy and we do digital. So we do other things beyond those language skills. The CLB framework provides a standardized way to assess language skills. It helps learners, educators, and employers understand what someone's language proficiency level is, and also is meant to be a framework to help plan both learning activities and assessment activities. It's widely used in language training programs. It's used in immigration, it's used in education, and it's used in employment contexts all across the whole country. So it is standardized across all of Canada. The benchmarks are organized into those 3 stages, as I said, numbered 1, 2, and 3, and each stage is associated with the complexity and demand within that stage. There are 4 benchmarks within each stage, and it shows progress from initial to fluent ability within that stage. So I'm not going to read through what each of the stages are, but I do think it's important to have a good sense of what they are, because sometimes a learner will come in your program and they will know what their Canadian language benchmarks are. If they know what they are or they've been assessed, that's some information that you have at your fingertips to kind of get a sense of where they're at. And I'm trying to show you some of the tools today that you can access quite easily, freely to actually get a sense of that. So you don't have to be an expert in the CLBs, but it does help if you have a general understanding how they work and what they mean. And that's why I thought I would just incorporate a bit of information about that into the presentation today. Another thing that they have that is kind of a companion to the Canadian language benchmarks is a document called the can-do statements. And if you're going to invest any time in looking at anything, the can-do statements are quite helpful. They're actually developed or were developed to describe what the learners can do at each of those benchmarks in terms of listening, speaking, reading, and writing. The purpose of these documents are actually to use with learners so that they can understand how they can understand at their own level what their abilities are, and that's why they're called can-do statements. So I'm not suggesting that you use these with learners. I'm actually suggesting that they're a great tool for instructors, LBS instructors, to get a sense of what people can do at each of those different levels. So I've just pulled and thrown into the presentation an example of what somebody can do at listening, CLB level 3, and speaking, CLB level 3, because of course we're focused on whether or not they can somebody is able to engage with LBS material in terms of speaking and listening. So this gives you a bit of a sense of what somebody would be able to do at a level 3. So again, as I explained, the statements are really developed to be able to be used with learners to explain to them what they can do at each level. But they're a great tool. And when we get on in the presentation, I'm going to show you a website where everything in this presentation can be accessed off that website. So you don't have to write all of this down. You'll be able to just go to the website and find all of these documents or links to these documents. Okay, before I go on, I just want to make sure that there aren't any questions. Give you a chance to ask questions. There's quite a bit of information in this presentation, and it might be a bit overwhelming, but again, you're going to have access to a website where it's all linked and also the presentation itself. So I just want to make sure, take a breath, make sure that there aren't any questions before we kind of move on. Okay. One other document that I just want to make people aware of is called the Canadian Language Benchmarks and Essential Skills Comparative Framework. So it's another tool that can help you understand the relationship between the Canadian language benchmarks and the OALCF, because the 3 levels of the OALCF, or Ontario Adult Literacy Curriculum Framework, are actually related to the first 3 levels of the original Essential Skills Framework. So this is just another companion tool that can help you select materials if you are using materials that are related to the CLBs, because it gives you kind of the correlation to those essential skill levels, which again correlate to the levels in the Ontario Adult Literacy Curriculum Framework. We know that essential skills are now called skills for success. So there's some changes in terms of what's happened with essential skills, but this is still a great document just to help ground yourself if you're accessing resources that are actually leveled according to the CLBs as opposed to the OALCF. Okay, I'm going to switch gears a little bit and just talk about some of the unique characteristics and needs that you might run into if you're working with ESL learners. So a lot of these unique characteristics and needs are also things that we might see with literacy and basic skills learners, but there are some differences as well. So what we do know is that adult ESL learners do have some unique things compared to somebody who would be a native English or native French speaker. So in terms of motivation, adult ESL learners often have intrinsic motivation driven by practical needs such as job opportunities, quick integration into society, or academic pursuits. Their motivation is often tied to real life goals and outcomes. This is also true for LBS learners, but for some categories of immigrants or newcomers coming into the system, depending on the level of support they have when they get here, they can be very motivated because they need to find work quickly and they need to get their skills to a level where they're able to do that. We, in my LBS program, when we are working with ESL groups, my instructors have noticed that, and I have too. There's a different type of intrinsic motivation that you often see with some of the groups of ESL learners. In terms of life experience, all adult learners bring a wealth of life experiences into the classroom or the group or the one-on-one tutoring situation. They have varied educational backgrounds, work experiences, and cultural perspectives that really influence their approach to language learning. And I think that this is often even more so when you see newcomers coming into the program because they've come from somewhere completely different cultural experiences, often very different work experiences. So there's a lot there to unpack, and it can be very different for them coming into our society. In terms of language transfer, adult ESL learners may already be proficient in one or often more than one language. This can really influence their acquisition and their learning. It can be positive transfer because sometimes languages are very similar and it really helps learning, but it can also have a negative influence or negative transfer where differences can lead to errors, where the languages are very, very different. And again, that's something that you could do a whole webinar on, but it's just something to be aware of. Learning styles and preferences. These are all shaped by prior experiences and personal characteristics. And we see that with LBS learners as well as with any learner, but these can be very different than things that you experience with a native LBS learner to Canada. Responsibilities and time constraints. Again, we see this with all learners, but with ESL learners, they often have multiple responsibilities such as work, family, and community obligations. And this can really impact their availability and might require some flexibility in terms of scheduling and learning options. And sometimes this is why we see ESL learners trying to access LBS services, because the services being offered through language training are full-time or only online or just not available. And that doesn't always work with their schedules. Fear of making mistakes. I think this is pretty common across the board in terms of adult learners. So just, but again, with ESL learners, it's the same. Specific learning needs. Adult ESL learners, they might have needs that are really specifically related to things like their professional field, daily interactions or academic pursuits. And again, their needs could be very motivated, like they need to do things very quickly. They need to access things quickly. Tailoring instruction to address these needs is obviously necessary for good outcomes, and it's something that LBS is really well positioned to do because it's something that we do with all of our learners. Cultural awareness and sensitivity. Adult ESL learners are going to bring some pretty vast and varied cultural perspectives, and this can really influence their language learning experience. And being sensitive to cultural differences and communication styles, norms, and values it's really important to be aware of that and be sensitive to it, because you can see some very different things that you're not necessarily used to, and likewise the adult learners aren't necessarily used to the types of systems and processes that we use here. Goal-oriented learning. All of our learners are goal-oriented in terms of their learning, or we try to ensure that they're supported in choosing or working towards an appropriate goal. Often, ESL learners have some really specific, it might be a certification exam, it might be getting employment. It could be something like getting their license so that they can get employment or get to things. So they're often very goal-oriented in terms of the learning that they are trying to do within the program. So I think that this is just kind of it's a bit of a laundry list. They are unique to ESL learners, but there is some crossover to the LBS learners that we already work with. But just important to keep all of these things in mind as you're working with ESL groups that might be coming into your program. Okay. Again, instruction tips when you're working with ESL learners. So most of these I kind of curated from a really good article, which I've sourced at the bottom, and just from our experiences in program and working with ESL learners. This could be an entire webinar, and we'll probably do a little bit more in-depth discussion around some of this in the next webinar. But I'm just going to walk through some of the things to take into consideration. Like LBS learners, finding out what learners know, need to know, and want to know, and then building on that is important. But also doing that from the perspective of the culture that that person's coming from and the experiences, the life experiences they're coming from. So, building on that where possible. This comes out in a lot of the research, and that is pre-teaching vocabulary and previewing unfamiliar things like actions, vocab, settings, things like titles, pictures, graphs, and text structure. So when you're introducing any types of text to ESL learners, it's important to actually do the pre-teach on a lot of the elements and vocabulary. Limiting the number of vocabulary items that must be pre-taught. In order to do that, really being careful about the readings or the you're selecting for learners, to try to limit what you have to pre-teach in order to introduce that stuff. It's always suggested when you do some research into working with ESL learners that you teach high frequency vocabulary first. So a good example of this would be, instead of teaching, this is kind of a simplified example, but instead of teaching all the colors like red, yellow, black, blue, white at the same time, you would actually start with a color, and that color that you would pick would be a color that is used more frequently than other colors, for example, red, and teach just about that color. Providing learners with multiple exposures to specific words in different contexts. So again, that builds on that, picking one thing and presenting that in a variety of different contexts. Another tip is to avoid, and these are a lot of things that we do typically when we're instructing. So these are things to avoid specifically when you're working with ESL groups or learners. So teaching vocabulary in what would be a semantic set or grouping. So teaching all the colors together, which I just used as an example, or teaching all the foods together, can actually, in some cases, impede learning of vocabulary. And this is because if similar or new words are presented together, like a set of colors, the learner is more likely to confuse the words. And instead of grouping, it's usually better to group vocabulary around themes, like real life themes, like going out to eat or planning a trip or planning a party, those types of things. Teaching in themes and introducing the vocabulary related theme instead of teaching in semantic sets is actually a pretty standard underlying way to approach teaching learners that are actually English as a second language learners. Other tips include having bilingual dictionaries on hand if you're working with ESL learners. There's many different ones out there. The Oxford makes great bilingual dictionaries. If you have particular groups of people, like you have a lot of immigrants, say from Ukraine, so having some bilingual dictionaries on hand can be really helpful. It's helpful for everybody, actually. Visual aids and physical objects, like actually tactile and visual ability to teach with to associate things with actual physical things. And flashcards. Flashcards are used a lot in ESL instruction, and it's a tried and true way. We do it in LBS as well. But it is something that is very useful in when you're working with English as a second language learners. So all of these things are just little tips and things to think about. Some of these things you would do anyways. Other things you might have to think, flip the way you do things a little bit when you're working with an ESL learner. bit of trial and error. People who are trained to work with ESL learners go through a process kind of like teachers college, where they learn very specific methodologies and instructional processes to be able to really effectively work with ESL learners. But it's good to have a few of the tips on hand if you're working with groups. Um, I'm gonna give you a link a little later on to a pop-up PD webinar that was just done a couple weeks ago, and it was multi-presenters. And one of the presenters gave a lot of great tips on working with ESL learners beyond just what I've even said today, which will give you some additional information about strategies to use when you're teaching. Okay, again, I'm just gonna take a second here and see if there are any questions before we move on. Again, there's a lot of information in this webinar. I wasn't, I wanted to make sure I touched on a lot of different things for people and gave you some things to take away and actually do some more research on yourselves. Questions? You are a quiet group this afternoon. Okay. Another thing I wanted to touch on was the fact that often when you're working with learners that are English as a second language learners, or not depending on what's happening in the world, you will often get groups of learners that have experienced trauma. And it's really important to be aware of that. These are just some guidelines around or things that you should consider when you're potentially working with clients that might have endured pretty substantial trauma prior to coming to Canada. And again, I'm not doing, I'm not an expert on this. These are just things that I've picked up from instructors, things that I've seen, things that I've read about. But this is something that is, you should consider investing some time in learning a little bit more about a trauma-informed approach if you're working with groups of ESL learners. There's a comment here in the chat. Oops. To take this on. Okay, so the comment is as an only Ontario certified teacher, I don't have the minimum TESOL test, TEFL, TESOL certification requirement for ESL teaching in Canada. I don't feel it would be professionally responsible for me to take this on without gaining certification thoughts. So I guess I'm just gonna comment on that. I think that what we're talking about here is not teaching ESL per se. I think what I am, and maybe I'm a little I'm trying to give you tips on if you're working with ESL learners. So what you would be delivering is still LBS, but I think that what we're trying to do here is just give you some information about things to consider because there are differences in working with this group. In order to teach an actual ESL class, an ESL funded program, if you have provincial funding, you have to actually have a TESOL Ontario certification. To teach in the federally funded program, you do not have to have that, but almost everybody does. So if you're teaching a formal ESL class, yes. If you're doing some support as an LBS agency and trying to work with ESL learners, I think that we're not gonna have certified people. I'm actually delivering this. What we're looking at is how can, as LBS programs, how can we fill in some of those gaps and ensure that people aren't completely falling through the cracks and not getting any service at all. Okay, so okay, you're welcome. I hope that kind of answers your question. So I'm not trying, this webinar isn't meant to say you should all be going out and teaching ESL classes. this webinar is really about, we're seeing ESL learners out there that can't access service right now, and they're coming to our programs. So what are some of the things that we can do to ensure that they're supported well in our programs while we deliver literacy and basic skills? Okay, so for trauma, we do see that a lot. We see people who have come from where they kind of experienced very significant trauma coming out of war zones. We see that a lot. We see that with LBS learners as well, though. There's lots of LBS learners that have trauma as well. So this is a great practice to invest some time in learning about this, regardless of whether you're applying it to working with learners that are technically ESL learners or just learners in general. So just some of the things to consider. Validating experience. So taking people's feelings seriously and validating their experiences, no matter how small they may seem to us. It's quite incredible. You know, something that might seem really not that important to us can really be very traumatic and be causing significant trauma for somebody. Respecting pace, allowing people to share experiences at their own pace without pressuring them for details. That's an important one because we tend to engage people or try to engage people in LBS in lots of discussion and communication and sharing often, and reading the signs and not pressuring somebody to share when they're not ready is really important. If you have people that potentially have some significant or even just trauma in general. Even I've heard some discussions around our intake form and the self-identification questions on the intake form, and even people seeing that or having to engage with some of that information being asked can actually be triggering. So it's just being aware of that and being very careful about them. Instead of assuming what you think somebody needs, asking somebody how they can be supported directly is important. Being mindful of triggers in general. And triggers can be things that you're not really expecting. Triggers can be something as simple as a noise that maybe happens in your building that you wouldn't think is triggering, but could be triggering for somebody, depending on the type of facility you're in. So just being aware that that can cause stress for people and being mindful of it. Promoting a positive environment that's free from hostility, discrimination, and harassment. We all endeavor to do that, but again, just being extra mindful of that. Respecting boundaries, and I think this goes both ways. Honoring boundaries of learners, trying not to ask invasive questioning, even if, and again, sometimes questions don't seem invasive to us, but it might seem invasive to somebody else. The boundary thing, I think, goes the other way, though, respecting your own boundaries and not getting involved, especially if people are bringing other things into the program. So trying to make sure you have boundaries to that as well. Providing support resources. So making sure that you can make referrals to other supports in your community. We do that anyways in LBS. It's one of our services that we offer, trying to make sure that people have wraparound service and are supported. But especially important when working with groups that might have experienced trauma. Encouraging self-care, that also goes both ways, encouraging self-care with the clients and with yourself. Being patient, and then training staff. So ensuring all staff members can access training in trauma-informed care to create just some more understanding and a more supportive environment is a great thing to be able to do. At the bottom of this slide, there's a link, and the link is to something called the Newcomer Navigation Network. And this, when we get to the website, which I'm going to show you, you can also access it via a link on that website. This organization, you have to have a membership, but the membership is free. You just sign up, and they have a lot of great resources on this website, just about in general about working with newcomers, but also they have, I think I did a search and they had 48 different resources, webinars and other resources around trauma-informed, just a trauma-informed kind of practice and having more understanding around that. So just something to be aware of. I like to tell the story, tell you a quick story about the program that I run. We needed to put some safety measures in place in the building, which was an administrative building. There was no way to notify people if there was a kind of a significant event like a fire or a lockdown or that kind of thing. And health and safety thought it would be a great idea to, think of anything better, to actually create a signal to let everybody know that there was something significant. And they thought using an air horn would work because everybody in the building would be able to hear it. And immediately I said, like, absolutely not, because an air horn to a lot of people signals a bomb happening, and can create a very, very response, physical response in people. So, and that's just a lack of knowledge, like not understanding how those things that we maybe think are okay can actually have a very negative impact on people who have experienced trauma. So again, I'm definitely not an expert. I'm still learning about all of this. So I'm just trying to share some of the things that I've learned over the years, but I would encourage people to consider this if you are seeing people who have come from groups of people who have come from, countries that maybe are at war. They've come out of some terrible situations. Just think about this stuff and learn a little bit about it, because it creates a much better learning environment for everybody if you're aware of this. Okay, before I move on, just another quick check-in to see if anybody has questions. I'm gonna switch gears again. I'm gonna talk a little bit about. Okay, so in terms of working with learners that would be more traditionally ESL learners, but we're supporting them in LBS. I asked some of the instructors that I know and that I work with, what are some of the most common milestones that you use with the groups that you're working with? If you're working with groups that are primarily ESL groups. And these were the ones that came up. So number one or number two, which are read a classified ad or an email, or read a course description in an email. You'll notice that most of these have an adapted version. So the adapted version actually allows the practitioner to typically read the instructions to support the learner in answering whatever the questions are on the milestones. Not all of them, but most of them are adapted versions. Number 7, integrating ideas and information from a textbook or manual, which is actually a level 3 milestone. And an example of that is integrating the driver's handbook, reading sections of the driver's handbook, because getting a license, getting your G1 is very common. Providing number 15, which is communicate one, providing directions and instructions. That one also has an adapted version. 27, completing a personal information form and making entries in a calendar is a common one. And connecting an internet search, number 55, is another common one. So these are just, I asked a few different practitioners who are working with small groups that are primarily ESL learners that are accessing LBS service, because they just don't have any other options, and they're able to engage with what's being delivered in LBS. And these are the ones that came up. They're not meant to be a comprehensive list. They're just kind of food for thought. There's lots of new milestones that have been posted in the last year. So there's lots of other milestones that would also be very conducive. Again, it all depends on what they're there for, and what their goals are, and what their like their both long-term and short-term goals are in terms of what milestones you would use. But these are very common ones. Okay. So the next so what I'm going to do is try to just share with you a bunch of resources that might be helpful. And this was kind of one of the things that I was asked to do in this webinar, just to try to pull together resources or lead you to some resources that might be helpful. I talked about a pop-up PD that happened recently. So the pop-up PDs are a series of webinars that happen every year. Contact North is a partner. There's a number of different support organizations that participate in putting these together. And the most recent one, which took place just a couple of weeks ago, was about transitioning ESL learners to LBS. So very much along the same lines of the webinar that we're doing today. Very timely. This is a big topic right now across the province because of the fact that we are seeing so many ESL learners accessing LBS services because they make sense for them for a number of different reasons. So in this webinar, I think there were 4 or 5 panelists. I actually participated as well, but I was at the very end, so ran out of time. But it was great because you heard from different practitioners across the province talking about their experiences in working with ESL learners in their programs and some of the strategies that they're using. So there's a lot of great information in this particular pop-up PD that really complements what we're talking about today. And it is available. I've put the link here. It's available, and I'm not sure if I think the actual PowerPoint will also be made available, but I believe the recording's up already. So I would encourage you, if you want to learn more and hear other perspectives, this is a good place to start with some additional professional development around this. The Labatt Literacy Ontario bookstore actually has a section of resources that are specific to English as a second language. These resources aren't free, so I'm just preface with that. They do cost to purchase them, but they're there. If you already are using something like Labatt Way to Reading, for example, there is a companion to Labatt Way to Reading called English, and that companion is a teacher's manual that gives you tips and helps you use those materials with English as a second language learners. There's a number of other series available on there that you can also access. And I know of some programs that are using different series across the province. It's just a source of information or a source of kind of pre-made material that you can access, but again, it's not free. What is free is a resource that Labatt also put together called ESL Resources for LBS. So this is a mini Google site, and we put this together when the initial wave of Ukrainian immigrants started arriving to Canada, because this seemed to really trigger a huge influx or need for additional service for ESL learners, and a lot of them were seeking service at literacy and basic skills agencies. So this particular mini site was put together to try to pull resources together for practitioners where they could access them quickly and be able to just get stuff right away. So on the landing page of this There's two toolkits. One's called the Ukrainian Evacuation Toolkit and one's called the Afghan Resettlement Toolkit. These toolkits are both put together by the network that I suggested people link to, and if they want some more information on trauma-informed responses. And so if you access those two toolkits, it will take you to that website. Those toolkits are very useful if you are seeing a group of, say, Ukrainian immigrants, or we're now seeing a lot of Afghan immigrants coming into Canada again. So you might see them start to resettle in the northern regions over time. So the landing page essentially has those toolkits, and then the site itself is divided up into a few different sections. Each section has a ton of resources in it. So that kind of gives you an overview. From the slide deck, I've hyperlinked everything in here, so it will take you right to the right page. There's a page full of online resources, and these are websites where learners can practice various skills, or you can have people access them. The online resource page, those things are best used online because they are actually, some of them are games and just sites that are really great for learners to access. A few of them do have downloadable resources as well, but because they have something like an audio file that's online, I've left them in the online resources section. There's also a section of resources called printable resources, and those are classroom ready things that people can access quickly and download. Most of them are CLB resources, so Canadian Language Benchmark resources. The focus of this site is to pull resources specific to ESL. We have access to lots of resources on the resources forum site. All of our LBS resources, or most of them, are there. But so these are more CLB based resources if you want to pull and integrate some of them into programming. There is a page on assessment. It just gives some assessment tools. They are CLB related assessments. And there's a page of speaking and listening ideas, and I like to, they're kind of homework things that you can send people home with to work on, ideas to improve their skills. Same with reading and writing. And last but not least, there is a series of background documents on there. Some of the documents that I've referenced today are there. So it gives you the CLB document, a guide to teaching ESL, and other background documents. So again, the purpose of this isn't because LBS programs should be opening ESL classrooms. There is funding for that. The purpose of all of this is to try to provide you with resources that you can access if you're seeing groups of learners that would be traditionally English as a second language learners accessing service in LBS. Okay, so I would just encourage you to check the site out, go through the site, see what's there, because there are lots of resources there. We update it continuously, so every time something new comes up, we try to add it to the website so that it's always fairly up to date. And it's something that we'll continue to update for the next few years, because I know that this is something that I don't see it coming to a close anytime soon, because I don't see huge amounts of funding being put into the provincial adult long credit program. And in terms of the federal program, they just did a round of 5-year contracts. Well, they did a call for proposal for 5-year contracts. So it will be interesting to see what types of services are funded when those calls actually are finalized and they put the contracts out for that. In the meantime, I think we're going to continue to see a lot of interest from learners who want to access LBS services or just don't have any other options. Okay, so that's all that I have for content. It was a lot of content, I know that. I'm going to take a second and see if anybody has any questions. Again, very, very quiet. But I'll give you a second. Earlier on, I did add the presentation into the chat. I'm going to do it again, just in case somebody joined afterwards. So it's uploading right now. You can either scroll to the beginning of the chat and it might be there, or when it's uploaded, you can download it if you want. I hope that this met your expectations. It was it was a very broad overview and a lot of information. Again, there is a plan, depending on what happens with all of our business plans, to try to provide another webinar in the new year as a follow-up, kind of a review, a follow-up, and maybe do some research with the programs to see if there's specific things that they'd like to have covered. But please, if you have any questions, feel free. The presentation's pretty big, so it's still uploading. It will take a couple minutes if you want to download it before you leave. And if not, you should be able to contact either Marissa, or I think Laurel will probably be able to send it out as well. Hey, I'm still not seeing any questions. I'll thank all the people who are thanking me. Thank you for coming today. Presentation is almost done uploading again. Hey, before we close out, did you have anything that you wanted to say, Marissa?
No, thank you very much
Okay.
for the wonderful presentation. I appreciate it.
Okay, just if you wanted to address anybody, again, the presentation is still uploading. It's just taking forever, so it's quite large. I will make sure that you'll be able to send that out to people as well.
Perfect. Thank you so
Okay.
much.
Okay. Okay, it is uploaded now, so if you scroll back in the chat before you leave, you should be able to download it. And I'll also make sure that it is available so it can be sent out. So everybody, I hope you have a great rest of your day. And hopefully I will see you again in the new year, the new fiscal year.
Thanks, Robin. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.